everyone, this is Chris Grosso on behalf of the IndieSpiritualist.com, and I am super thrilled to have my guest today, Matthew Fox, with us. Matthew is the author of over 30 books, a preeminent scholar and popularizer of Western mysticism. He became an Episcopal priest after being expelled from the Catholic Church by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict the 16th. You can visit him at matthewfox.org. Matthew, you sound like a rebel after my own heart. Thank you for being with me today.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you.
Thanks. So, we're going to be talking mostly about your new book today, which is titled Meister Eckhart, A Mystic Warrior for Our Times, a book that I have read and I am a huge fan of. But before we jumped into that, I wanted to quickly start by reading actually something that's on the back jacket of one of your older books that I love, Meditations with Meister Eckhart. And I'm just going to quickly read that for our viewers. It's a quick paragraph, and we'll start from there and let this take us where it will. It reads, while Hindus and Buddhists claim Eckhart as one of their own, while psychologists like Jung and Marxists like Bloch and Fromm learn from him, many Christians hardly know the name, much less the spiritual tradition he represents so beautifully. So Matthew, my question to you to get things started is, for the benefit of those that don't know, who was Meister Eckhart, and what is this spiritual tradition that he represents?
Well, Eckhart lived from 1260 to 1329, so he was late 13th, early 14th century. He was 13 years old when Rumi died, and Hafiz was a contemporary of Eckhart. Eckhart was 17 when Thomas Aquinas died. So, and he was 20 when Mechtilde Magdeburg died. So there was this thing happening. It was in the air. Maybe it was in the water. Not unlike today, when you had some of these great mystics walking the earth at the same time.
Yeah.
And really saying very similar things. Because mystics around the world tend to say similar things and even use similar symbols. For example, one symbol important to Eckhart was spark of the soul. He talks about how the spark of your soul never goes out. It's immortal. It's the Holy Spirit at work, or it's the manger where the Christ is born. And he goes on, he plays with it. But he also tells us he got that image, spark of the soul, from Avicenna, a Muslim philosopher who lived 200 years before him. And Rumi has marvelous poems about the spark of the soul. He says, the spark of the heart is not easily lit, and it'll burn down your house and all this. So he goes on, too, about spark of the soul. So anyway, Eckhart was a great mystic, a member of the Dominican order, which I was also a member of for 34 years until the Pope gave me a big slip. And Thomas Aquinas was also a Dominican. And the Dominicans were... they had an intellectual life. They were a big part of the university movement that was launched in the early 13th century, if you will. And but they were also mystics. They were supposed to be contemplative as well, and activists. They were like Franciscans. Francis and Dominic were peers and contemporaries. They reacted against the monastic privileges of the feudal establishment that had been running for many centuries in the West. And they felt the monks had become too fat, too lazy, and too much out in the countryside, because the young people were flooding the towns and turning them into cities overnight. And they didn't really have anyone to really, because education and worship was centered in the feudal countryside with the monks. This new generation wanted, some attention. And so Dominic, to his credit, sent his men into the order, into the universities all over Europe, which were new inventions, again, from Islam, by the way. It came through Islam. And so it was a time of great creativity and great, by that time, I mean the early 13th century. When Eckhart came along, things were running out of steam, and the academia was becoming corrupt, and so was religion again. So Eckhart is a rebel. He's trying to reform. For example, he aligned himself with the women's movement of his day, which we call the Beguines. And the Pope was so threatened by the Beguines that he condemned them 17 different times, which is really kind of funny. I mean, if you're going to condemn something, you think once would be enough, but out damn spot. You know, it wasn't working. When that Pope died, he was the same Pope who condemned Eckhart a week after he died, by the way, John the 22nd. When he died, there are probably a million Beguines all over Europe, so his condemnations didn't go very far. But the Beguines were a women's movement. They were women who did not want to get married and did not want to be nuns living in a cloistered convent. They wanted to live in the world, work with young people, with the sick, with the poor. And they were artisans. They earned their living often with weaving and sewing and making stained glass windows and things. And Eckhart strongly supported them, and they supported him. And he picked up a lot of this feminist language, and he had a lot of it. For example, he said, "What does God do all day long? God lies on a maternity bed giving birth." So the whole theme of birthing, creativity, which is very much a feminist theme, was very important to him. Yeah. So he also allied with the peasants. In Eckhart's day, he was German. And in Eckhart's day, there was no real German language as there is today. There was just dialects, which are different with each peasant group. Eckhart was the first intellectual to preach in German. So he kind of gathered these dialects of the poor and made theology out of it in the best sense, a living theology through the art of preaching. And remember, at that time, preaching was the only show in town. There was no iPad and there was no TV and radio and or film. But yeah, Eckhart was amazing because he was such a profound mystic, and he was an activist as well, we would say today, because he worked with the poor and the peasants. We discovered the transcripts of his trial in the 19th century in Nicholas of Cusa's library. Nicholas of Cusa is on the Rhine River also. He was a scientist and mathematician and a mystic. And David Bohm, the late physicist, says, "I owe more to Cusa than I do to Einstein," which is quite a stunning statement from a 20th century physicist's mouth. But we found the transcripts of Eckhart's trial in Cusa's library in the 19th century, and in it there's this passage where his inquisitors say to him, "Why are you preaching to the poor people in their own language, telling them that they're other Christs, that they're sons and daughters of God, and that they have to give birth to the Christ every day, just like Mary did? You're confusing them," they said. "They're confusing them. Preaching Latin would let you go." Did Eckhart say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'll go back into Latin, so only the intelligentsia can understand me"? He said this. He said, "The poor need to learn, for if they do not, they will never know how to live or why to die." And 10 years after he spoke those statements at his trial, the peasant wars broke out in Germany. Tens of thousands of peasants were slaughtered. It was a class war. Eckhart saw this coming. And instead of living a comfortable life, he tried to do something about it. And his main strategy was to build up the strength of the peasants by telling them the truth, that they're other Christ, and that they have dignity and the powers of empowerment for responsibility for justice and for their own survival. So Eckhart is a major figure. Now, he was condemned a week after he died by Pope John the 22nd, and but it was a political condemnation, like most of them are. And but because of that, his work went underground, and it really didn't. It came up in little bits here and there, but it came up mostly, I think, in George Fox, the Quaker rebel of the 17th century, who combined contemplation and action. That's what Eckhart was doing, and unfortunately, that movement got sat on by the mainstream religious authorities, and it took centuries, I think, to come back, and it came back, especially in the form of George Fox, I think. First time I ever lectured on Eckhart, it was 35 years ago in Chicago at a Quaker center. When I finished, this woman who ran the center, big, strong, she bellowed from the back of the room, "My God," she says, "that sounds exactly like George Fox." Well, yeah, she woke me up to that connection. That if Eckhart had not been condemned, I doubt that there would have been a Reformation. I think it would have been a far more profound and radical shift in Christian awareness. But that my new book shows, Eckhart is stunning for our time because he's so ecumenical. Buddhists call him a Buddhist, and Sufis call him a Sufi, and Hindus call him a Hindu. Whoa, there's no one on earth that gets that kind of accolades.
Right.
So what's going on here? There's a depth to Eckhart that is also a breadth, because once you go deep enough into your own soul, you go down to the truths of Buddhism, insofar as they are archetypal and universal. You touch the truths of Hinduism and Sufism, and also shamanism. I have a chapter on Eckhart and shamanism too in this new book. So I think we couldn't understand him till today. Your generation can, though, because he is so interspiritual. He is so interfaith, and I think that's why he's really an important figure today.
That's great, because I was actually going to add, that was my next question, is why, is he important to us today? So thank you for already touching on that. And you actually, another question I was going to ask you in a few minutes, but we'll just jump into this and go back to something else I had. You mentioned the interfaith, and I know that you write that he was a champion of interfaith, which is something that's obviously becoming more and more popular these days. So if you wouldn't mind elaborating a bit more on that, that would be awesome.
Well, I put him in the room with Thich Nhat Hanh in my chapter on Buddhism, because I really respect Thich Nhat Hanh, and I wanted to see them interact, so to speak. And it's so telling how much they share in common. For example, Thich Nhat Hanh loves the phrase, God is the ground of being. Yeah. And he attributes that to Paul Tillich, the 20th century German Protestant theologian. But Tillich got it directly from Eckhart. Tillich was German, and he knew Eckhart very well. So really, Thich Nhat Hanh doesn't know this, that really Tillich is standing on the shoulders of Meister Eckhart. So I hope Thich Nhat Hanh gets my book and learns this, because Eckhart and Thich Nhat Hanh have so much in common. Thich Nhat Hanh, like most Buddhists, like the apophatic divinity. The apophatic divinity is very well developed in Eckhart. And what does it mean? Well, it's two words in Greek, no, and phatic, no light. No light. Phatic, the word photography, all that comes from that same Greek word. Now, Eckhart says God is super essential darkness, who has no name and will never be given a name. So the apophatic divinity is about the mystery side of divinity. And Eckhart is really big on that. He talks a lot about the Godhead, and the Godhead too, for Eckhart, is not about the God of creation or the God of light or the God of liberation or salvation, but the Godhead is about not history but mystery, not action but non-action or being. And the point is to have a balance. And the West has not had a balance for centuries. When people hear the word God, they think, oh, creation or redemption or salvation or something. But we've left out that contemplative dimension to the Godhead, which, by the way, in Eckhart's two languages, German and Latin, is feminine. So that's part of it, too. A patriarchal culture leaves out the being side of things and the contemplative side of things. And this is one reason Buddhism is so attractive to Westerners today, because Buddhism has that dimension of the Godhead much more richly developed at this time. So that is another thing that Eckhart and Thich Nhat Hanh have in common. And Thich Nhat Hanh even says, when Christianity recovers this apophatic tradition, then its real treasure will come forward again. Well, Eckhart is the leader in the apophatic tradition, so he has a lot to say there. And let me add this too, again, in light of your generation. Well, we're learning from science about the universe. And we're hearing that 97% of all matter and energy in the universe is dark matter and dark energy. Now, no one knows what that really means yet. Science is stumbling in the dark about it. But the point is that why wouldn't then? Why wouldn't we then want a spirituality too that is at home in the dark,
Right.
as well as in the light?
Yeah.
And Eckhart he says, the ground of the soul is dark. And when you think of it, the depths of everything are dark. Of the cosmos. This is what turned astronauts and cosmonauts into mystics, was they're going up into space,
right,
and realizing the deep silence and the deep darkness. And that's what made the glowing Earth such a gem amidst the black sky. This is why so many of these ex-jet fighter pilots came back to Earth as mystics.
Sure.
Of course, went a little crazy because NASA didn't have a spiritual director on their faculty, and so a lot of them didn't know what to do with this conversion experience they had had. I once figured out what it cost to convert one of these astronauts into a mystic. It cost about $42 million a piece. There's got to be a cheaper way to bring the mysticism alive in them than that.
Sure. Well, I love that you're starting, actually, because I also wanted to ask you about your chapter with science. You talk a bit about Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry, and actually, before we get to that, there was a quote that was relevant to what you're just saying that I would love to share with our viewers from your chapter with Thich Nhat Hanh. But it's a quote from Eckhart in which he says, it's a part of his quote, in which he says, "Love God as God is, a not God, not mind, not person, not image, even more as he is pure, clear one, separate from all two-ness." And I love that, and I know a lot of my viewers are Buddhist, and I have a deep found connection with Buddhism as well, and when I read that, it immediately brought me back to the Dharmakaya, and Godhead. It's one and the same, and I thought that was truly beautiful.
Well, I couldn't agree more. You really landed on the right quote. I mean, that's pure Buddhism.
Yeah.
Now, where did Eckhart get it? He never met a Buddhist in his life. He never read a Buddhist book in his life.
Sure.
He got it, surprisingly, from his own journey into his own soul and his own lineage as a Christian.
Right.
So what this shows, first of all, it's a compliment to Buddhism, that Buddhism has discovered universal archetypal truths.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not kind of trademarked Buddhism. This is human nature they're talking about.
Yeah.
And but you really nailed it. That whole section, and there's more in that paragraph than just those sentences, is so Buddhist that it takes your head off almost. What is this? A 14th century Christian preacher?
Right.
But that's what's so exciting. Dr. Suzuki, the great Japanese Buddhist philosopher, back in 1959, had a dialogue with Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk. And at the end, Suzuki said, "Tom, you're a typical Western dualist. The only outside chance you have of getting Buddhism is to study the one Zen thinker of the West, Meister Eckhart." And Merton said, "Well, he's been condemned by the church." Suzuki said, "Well, I can't help that, can I?" So Merton thought it over. The next year, 1960, he spent the whole year doing two things, reading Zen poetry and Eckhart.
Yeah.
And it totally shifted him. The Merton of the 60s is totally different from the Merton of the 50s. And he died in 1968 in a trip to Asia. And he was writing in his notebook, "Eckhart is my lifeboat, Eckhart is my lifeboat." So it's a powerful story about that Buddhist side to Eckhart's soul. And for people who have gone from West to East to study Buddhism, I'm sure it's a beautiful awakening to know, hey, there's some of this in our own lineage as well.
Yeah.
So that's the joy, I think, and the excitement of the time in which we live, the time in which your generation is coming into its own.
Yeah.
That we're living in a unique moment of interspiritual rubbing of elbows.
Yeah.
And this holds a lot of hope, I think, for our species. And let's face it, we need all the hope we can get today.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. It's a very just inspiring time to be alive. A frightening time, on the other hand, as well, but very inspiring. And so, as I started to note before, you also talk about the relationship with science in your book. And that's something that's becoming increasingly exciting. With every day that passes, it's like, new things are popping up and correlations are being made. So I would love if you could elaborate a bit more on your chapter, again, that speaks to Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry and the relation of science and spirituality.
Yes. Meister Eckhart, like any pre-modern thinker, including, of course, indigenous people everywhere, didn't look on the world psychologically so much as cosmologically. They wanted to know about how we relate to the universe. Now, we lost this in the modern era because the modern era was so anthropocentric. It was all about us. It was so narcissistic. And, for example, Descartes saying truth is clear and distinct ideas, or I think, therefore I am. Where's the we in that? Where's community? In contrast, my friend Eddie Kneebone, who was an Aboriginal teacher from Australia, he used to say, he told the story how they teach their children that the stars are not just stars so many light years away, but are campfires of the ancestors. He says, and the ancestors up there in the sky with their campfires at the stars are looking down on Earth to see what's cooking, you see. So, in other words, that ancient tradition, and it's probably the oldest tribe on the planet, the Aboriginals, for tens of thousands of years, they've taught their young people there's a relationship between us and the stars. That's very important in terms of meaning, in terms of feeling at home in the universe and not feeling lonely in the universe. Right. So, this attitude is also Eckhart's, because cosmology is very important to your medieval awareness. Thomas Aquinas, who came right before him and was also Dominican, said that every human soul is capax universi, capable of the universe. Now today, that the machine universe of the modern era has been dismissed, and we're getting pictures from Hubble telescope and whatnot of the life, death, and rebirth of galaxies and supernovas and stars. The sky is alive again for us. And Father Sky is alive. And that has tremendous implications for a healthy masculinity and for a healthy placing of our planet and our history as humans into the context of the drama of the universe itself. So the new creation story we're getting from science, and it's so full of awe, wonder, and radical amazement that it can trigger in the heart of human beings, no matter what particular ethnicity or tribe or religion we come from, it can trigger a common sense of reverence again, and even humility, that each of us has come 13.8 billion years to be here. Wow. And what about all those who aren't here? I mean, it's kind of special to be here and unique. And to know, I mean, we just took a picture from the edge of the solar system, as you know, from a satellite we sent out 12 years ago, looking back on its journey. And what you see are a lot of small lights in space, and an arrow where the scientists say, and this one speck of light is Earth. Right. That is such an amazing icon for our time. I mean, if we really meditated on that one speck of that dot, that holy dot that is Earth, would we continue to spend $56,000 a second on weapons, which is what we're doing as a species? How crazy can we be with these wars and racism and sexism and everything else that's destroying us and destroying the planet? Let's put it in context. Our home is fragile and it's special, and who's going to save it if not us? Yeah. So I think all this has to do with science today. I think science is not an obstacle to healthy spirituality. In fact, it's an ally. Again, Aquinas said that a mistake about creation results in a mistake about God. We turn that around. An insight about creation results in insight about divinity. So we should be hungry for what science has to teach us and bring that into our belief systems. And we'll all be healthier for it.
Yeah, so beautifully said. I couldn't agree more. Um, Another thing I wanted to touch on with you is the the new vision of Christianity that your book and your work and the work of others like Andrew Harvey and just great teachers of our time are kind of bringing about. There's still a lot of dogma attached to Christianity and Catholicism. It's deeply rooted, and a lot of people still have issues with words like God or Christ. But I that's why I'm just so I'm having trouble even finding the word. I just really respect the work that you guys are doing in helping to change that. So, could you talk a little bit about this kind of new vision of Christianity or maybe it's the old vision, from the mystics, it's reemerging. What's your experience of it?
Well, again, that discussion we had on the apophatic divinity, I think, is very important.
Yeah.
Meister says, I pray God to rid me of God.
Right. Yeah.
I think a lot of young people are saying that today, have that prayer in their hearts, because the word God has been overused. We've stamped it on our coins and dollar bills and MX missiles. Mm-hmm. And, that shrinks, to put it mildly, the meaning of God is reductionism. And that's why the apophatic side, that we don't know who God is, and we'll never know who God is. God is beyond all words. It's very important to bring that back as the substratum of anything we claim to know about divinity. But I have a lot of fun, actually, coming up with new images for divinity. I mean, I see divinity as the being within being, and the light within light, the love within love, the beauty within beauty, the justice within justice, the compassion within compassion, the silence within silence. You see, there's no limit to names for God. The Vedas say that God has 1 million names and 1 million faces. But Thomas Aquinas in the West was even more radical. He said this. He said, every being is a name for God. Mm. And then he goes through a whole list from the Bible: stone, rock, dew, sun, wind. He goes through this whole list. And then he says, every being is a name for God, and no being is a name for God. Right. So, but I mean, that just opens your imagination, or opens the door. So the idea that God is restricted to the name God or Allah or Yahweh. One thing I learned from Native people, praying with Native people. I mean, they have names like Wankantanka and Tagashala and grandfather and grandmother. And so I think this is part of growing up, is feeding our imaginations and our language about divinity. It's also the work of the poets to come up with language that's fresh but authentic. And again, Eckhart is, and of course the whole idea of God as feminine, the divine mother and so forth, very important to bring that in, to balance the excessive gender co-optation by patriarchy. God as child. Eckhart says God is novissimus, the newest thing in the universe. Wow, that's not the old man with a beard, is it? Right. It's another image entirely. So, but he also warns us. He says every name we have for God comes from an understanding of ourselves. So if we limit our names to, say, the patriarchal God, to an all-male God, that says a lot about our souls. Sure. And so I think it's a great moment when we can break through and give birth to new images of divinity, of wisdom. Eric Jantsch, the great physicist, now deceased, says that God is the mind of the universe. Sure. And by mind of the universe, he says, I mean the interdependent wisdom of our ecosystems and all these other systems that interact with one another and so forth. I mean, he's quite explicit about what he means there. So what can I say? I think it's the time to opening our hearts and minds and coming up and calling on the poets, the poet in all of us, to give birth to new images and experiences of the divine.
I love that. And I also love how in your work, you talk about God in all things and all things in God. It's all all is it panentheism? I believe is
Panentheism,
right.
yes.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Theism will not do. Theism says we're here, God's there in the sky someplace, we have to pull God down through our prayers. That's anti-mystical, and it's dualistic. Right. Panentheism says everything is in God and God is in everything, just like a fish is in the water and the water is in the fish. And that's mysticism, because people have breakthroughs. They have moments of awareness. Sometimes you prepare, maybe through meditation or devotions or prayers, but often these just hit you. You may be out in the woods. You may be making love. You may be painting a picture. You may be hearing music. You may be just walking the street. And you're hit by this intuition that all things are connected. All things are one. And that's the mystical experience, the unitive experience. And that's not a small thing in your life. That has to become kind of the restart of our way of seeing the world. And it changes everything from politics to economics to religion and self-awareness. And this is what the mystics talk about. And we've all got this mystic, this lover within us. We have to give it more attention than our culture has told us to give it, and more attention than most of our churches and synagogues have been talking about for centuries. This is why someone like Eckhart is so important to kind of restart our mystical brains again. You know, it was Einstein himself who said we've been given two gifts: the sacred gift of intuition, and I consider intuition to be another word for our right brain or our mystical brain, and the gift of rationality, he said. He said rationality must serve intuition, but we live in a culture, he said, a society where we have forgotten the sacred gift, and we honor rationality by itself. And the reason he says intuition is so important, he says this is where values come from. Values don't come from the intellect, he says. Intellect gives you methods. It doesn't give you values. Values come from intuition and feeling, he says, which are the same thing, he says. Now, I love quoting this because no one can accuse Einstein of being anti-intellectual.
Sure.
But he's putting intellect in its place. It should be balanced with intuition, and even it should serve intuition. And we're nowhere near doing that. Look at our educational systems. Did you have a class on intuition when in any of your many years of education?
Definitely not.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And yet that's where values come from. So, hey, we're not training our young in terms of intuition. We're not training them in values, which is another way of saying when they get out of school, they will live the values of the culture and probably uncritically. Yeah. And what if the values of the culture are pathological? What if they lead to the end of the planet as we know it, to the global warming, to the destruction of species that's actually happening today at untold rates?
Sure.
And it goes on and on. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that Einstein named the issue is really it's an educational issue.
Yeah.
Are we honoring the right brain? And how can we? How do you teach mysticism? Well, I did that for over 30 years. I developed educational programs, pedagogy, that work. And the key is art. Art, what we call art is meditation. Not art to produce a product to sell in a capitalist market, but art as process. The process of interacting with clay or dance or music or poetry or gardening or repairing a car engine. To realize that the process, the way, is the goal, or the Christ. That's what it means to say the Christ is the way. You know, the process itself is what brings those sparks of the soul alive.
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear that. You know, in my first book, I write quite a bit about that. You know, we find it in all times and all places. We're riding a skateboard at a concert. It can be experienced and cultivated at all times. It's always there anyway. So
exactly.
It's so refreshing to hear you say.
What's the name of your book?
My first book, Indie Spiritualist.
Indie Spiritualist. That's right.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. So, yeah, it's really wonderful for me to hear, and as I've been reading your books through the years, you know, they've been very inspirational, and the beautiful thing is the words connect at a place at the heart, you know, and that I believe is where our true teachings stem from. That, you know, we all connect in this place. So it's really wonderful that it's cross-generational. The heart's a heart, it's just
Well said.
great to hear you say that. Thank you. So, Matthew, in close, my last question, and then I will give you the floor if there's anything I didn't cover that you would like to discuss, because your book, it touches on so many things that we haven't had a chance to get into: the divine feminine, shamanism. I mean, Black Elk. It really runs the gamut, and I can't encourage viewers enough to pick it up and read it. But the last thing I wanted to make sure I asked you was, what advice would you give for this younger generation of spiritual seekers, of truth seekers? Whether they're new to the path or not, what are some words of advice or wisdom you would like to leave them with?
Well, to listen deeply, listen to your call. Everyone's here for a purpose, and not just as individuals, but as communities and even a generation. It's so clear that we're not living in ordinary times. It's not time for business as usual, education as usual, religion as usual. And so you want to listen to your call. Everyone does have a call. And what are the values that you really cherish? What is it you really want to do, as Mary Oliver says, with your one precious and wild life? And don't necessarily adopt the priorities of the previous generation. Things are not as they were, and our awareness is expanding. The awareness both of our shadow and the evil we're capable of as a species, but also the awareness of spiritual practice and consciousness, and the potential expansion of our species in terms of its next evolutionary steps. I would also say, don't be over attracted by what Larry Dossey calls gee whiz technologies. I love that little endorsement he gave me for my book. He said, the humanity will not be saved by more gee whiz technologies, but by going deeper into the psycho-spiritual potential of our species. Because it's true. I mean, the appearance of the internet and all this, it seems to me, has not rendered war less present in our midst. If anything, it's made it more visible. We can all go on the internet, and so we should be feeling that. It's jarring. So we have to go deeper into what humans are and what's holding us back from our real potential as lovers and warriors of justice, eco-justice, social justice, economic justice, gender justice. So we're called both to be mystics and warriors, or mystics and prophets. And that's what I like so much about Eckhart, that he not only wrote about it with depth and passion, he lived it. He walked his talk. And we need to walk our talk too. And what looks like a dark thing, say you had to drop out of school because you can't afford it anymore, or you can't get a full-time job. What I've learned from a lot of young people are not living alone anymore because they can't afford to, but they're living in communities. And what happens is, while the initial purpose for that may be economic survival, what really happens is a whole new set of values arises when you're living in a community. And you rediscover the value of conviviality, of conversation, of meals together, of growing food. You have more time because you only have a half-time job. You can grow food, you can do spiritual practice, you can do political organizing. And it's a different world because you're literally moving more and more distant from those values, so-called, of a culture that has been uncritical of itself and that is putting people through an educational system that doesn't deal with values as such. So, what seems like a dark night, and I think we are in a dark night of the soul as a species, is in fact a very special time. The mystics tell us it's a time for learning the deeper, most important questions of wisdom and of compassion. And why are we here? What do we have to give back? And so I would just encourage young people along those lines. And I'd also articulate with them that fun is a virtue. Fun is a value. And I think that's kind of built into a lot of young people's journeys today. That it's not just about what are you going to do when you're 65 and want to retire. It's about the path itself deserves to have beauty and joy and fun along the way. And we have to learn to trust. And I think something is afoot globally. And I think Gaia is inspiring a lot of young people to be generous, to ask deeper questions, and even to have fun along the way of being generous.
I love that.
And giving.
So well said. You know, Matthew, that's all the questions I had. I mean, I could sit here for hours with you and go on and on about your work, but is there anything from the book that I didn't cover that you would like to finish up with? Any particular chapter that meant a lot to you or that you think would be valuable for our viewers to hear about, or anything in general you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I do think you mentioned the chapter on shamanism. Thomas Berry, who is a real prophet, deceased now, especially around the ecological issues, he used to say, we need fewer priests, though he was a priest, we need fewer priests, fewer professors, and more shamans. I think that's really interesting. And I think a lot of young people today are being bitten by shamanism, if you will. Sure. I think there is an attraction there. I think it's part of Gaia kind of asserting herself. And so to find that that Meister Eckhart also has a lot in common with shamans, and also that many scholars of the New Testament see Jesus as shamanistic in many of the stories there too. I think that's important, again, to realize that shamanism, as it returns, has a deep practice. And of course, when you step back and see the history of our species, for most of our existence, our religion was shamanistic, and we survived through some really rough times. And so there's a lot to learn, because it heals this horrible rift we have between nature and human nature, between nature and us, as if we're separate. And obviously we have to get that squared away if we're going to be warriors on behalf of Mother Earth. We have to rediscover the sacredness of nature and the meaning of sacredness and gratitude and reverence, all of which comes through those profound relationships with nature, including our own bodies, and to be caring of our bodies, and that would mean resisting corporate food invasions of our bodies and so forth. I mean, anything like that will have political, economic ramifications. Sure. And it's a wonderful thing, the number of young people I meet who are into nutrition and into yoga and into honoring their bodies. And the human body is a very special accomplishment of the universe and of this planet. And why would we take it for granted unless we had no spiritual sense whatsoever? So I had a dream years ago, and I'll end with this. And in the dream it said, there's nothing wrong with the human species today except one thing. Which I think is stunning. I could write 100 things that are wrong with human species. One thing. Wow, here's a shortcut. What is it? You've lost the sense of the sacred. That's what the dream said. The one thing wrong with us, you've lost the sense of the sacred. And that's what I think the new cosmology, I think our spiritual traditions are here to teach us. We have to travel much lighter with backpacks and not basilicas on our back. We have to learn what it means to be a mystic and a warrior or a prophet, and get into it. Roll up our sleeves and go to work. And that's the definition of hope, according to David Orr. Hope is a verb with the sleeves rolled up.
Well, I couldn't have asked for a better ending. I can't thank you enough for your time, Matthew. It has been a real pleasure. The name of the book, again, is Meister Eckhart, A Mystic Warrior for Our Times. You can visit Matthew Fox online at matthewfox.org, and Just quickly, do you have any workshops or teachings coming up, Matthew, or any what's on the horizon for you?
Uh, yeah, Friday I go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I'll be there Friday and Saturday, um, lecture and workshop. And what else? Well, I suppose I'd have to go to my webpage and see the
Okay,
schedule there.
sure.
But I know there's more coming up too.
Cool. Yeah. So anyone that's viewing, please connect with Matthew again at matthewfox.org and read his books if you haven't. It will change your life. So Matthew, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris, and I'm glad you have a program like this. I encourage you. Get the word out.
I will.
Alternative media.
Yeah. Thank you so much.